Our bare root cherry laurel hedging has just arrived. It came yesterday actually, so I made sure I gave it a spray with the hose overnight to keep the roots inside here moist, because they are bare root inside here. And we actually have, between this bag and this bag just on the floor here, believe it or not, 140 plants. So you can see why it's so economical in terms of price to be able to buy the bare root ones a lot cheaper, as opposed to having 140 plants in 2-litre pots, for example. So now these have arrived, I'm going to take the bag off these and we should be able to see what we're dealing with in here. And they're often bundled up into little groups. Nice, okay. Yeah, often in groups of about 10 or 15, like this, and they're tied up together as well. So if I just take that off there. Here is an example of one of our plants, and there's various options and sizes you can go for. These are the 30 to 40 centimetre, I believe. And I think you can get all the way up to 1 metre and they'll be more bushed. These do vary between them. You see, like, some are just single maiden stems like that, whereas others have already been kind of bushed out a little bit, probably with a bit of pruning in their first year. So the first thing, I just want to make sure these are still nice and damp within the root systems, which they are. And I don't want to leave these exposed, especially on a sunny, windy day like today, to dry out. So all the time I'm not dealing with these, I'm going to cover them back over with a bit of plastic. I've already got the vast majority of our holes dug, and I like to do that in advance of placing the order, really. It can take a week or two to come this time of year between November and March, which is the general bare root season here in the UK. Now, in general, I'm not really one for using products, but this root grow is something that I always use when I'm planting bare root hedges. And I've been planting them now for probably the last almost 8 years, almost every year, doing different boundaries here and for clients for our gardening work that we do. And I must say, when planted in the correct conditions, I've never lost a plant using this stuff. And what it basically is mycorrhizal fungi here. And to explain it as simply as possible, if you've ever seen the film Avatar, where you have that underground network of almost like a computer network where the plants are communicating and everything's connected and alive, it's kind of like that. If I can get into it. My hands are completely numb already. Okay, so in here, this pack size, I think this is 1 kilogram, and here's the gel in here, and this is our granules, which contains the mycorrhizal fungi. So what I'm going to do is pour our gel in, which kind of makes like a wallpaper consistency, actually. I'm going to stir this up now and then leave it a couple of minutes to start getting that nice consistency. You can see there already it's beginning to go slightly gel-like. And this water is courtesy from Mother Nature. We've had a lot of rain over the last few days, so this is filled up naturally. Okay, that is lovely now. Look at that, completely gel-like. Now I'm going to empty the contents of our root grow into here and give it a good stir. So the areas I'm going to be planting today are along this boundary here, down to the bottom corner, which is down there, and then coming right the way along here, passing the distance past the polytunnel there. And then I'm going to be coming down the side of this polytunnel here as well. And then finally along this strip here, adjacent to this other hedge, running right the way along there to the bottom. Now what I'll tend to do is dip 5 or 6 plants at a time, cover up the rest of the bundle of plants with some plastic so they don't dry out, and then I lay these out along the planting holes I'm going to plant first. And if you remember, some of our plants had a slight natural variation. Some are already nice and bushy, some aren't. So I like to stagger these out by putting a bushy one, and then a thinner one, and then a more bushy one, going along like that. So as our hedge establishes, you haven't got all the big healthier ones at one end and the thinner whippy ones at the other end. Just gives a more natural even growth to the hedge in the first few years. Okay, so now for the funner part of actually getting these in planted. And if you're doing this in winter like I am, some waterproof trousers or perhaps a kneeling pad is very beneficial, because you're going to be kneeling down in your mud you've already dug out the holes. And two things with actually planting the holes which I find of importance, which is probably worth mentioning, is digging your holes square as opposed to round is quite important, because if you dig a round hole, your roots will tend to come out as they establish and spiral round as if they're in a pot. Whereas if you do them into a square hole, they'll kind of run to the side and then they're kind of forced to go more into the soil, where it's not loose, where we haven't already dug our hole out of here, and really getting them root more established and stronger. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is hold our plant in the hole, roughly in the centre, and start pulling some of our soil in. And basically we want our soil line to be around about where the top of our roots are. And I'm holding the plant while I'm doing this, otherwise it tends to sink down into your hole a bit. And then give it a good push around to begin to remove some of the air gaps around the roots, which we don't want. Now I'm going to give these a gentle heel in with my heel, just to remove any more air gaps there. You don't want to go too mad and actually start tearing the roots off or anything, but just to take away all of those little air gaps. I often describe the plants as having a front and a back edge to them, which is the aspect that they've previously been growing before they've been sent to you. And you see the edge facing the camera now, the leaves are very dark green, and it's the top of them that you're seeing. Whereas if I turn the plant round, you're seeing mainly the underside of the leaves. So when this has previously been planted, before it's been sent to us, it's been facing kind of that way in the sun. So I like to mimic that with the planting. This side is where I'm going to be seeing the hedge from, so I'm going to plant that side facing forward. Something else I find really useful is actually having a small mini shovel like this, and I've got a lot of abuse for digging holes with these over the years from guys, but actually once you've dug your initial hole, when you're down on your knees, really handy to be able to just pick up a small amount of soil with one hand, as opposed to using a big old shovel, which is very difficult. So it just makes the job that little bit easier, which is always very welcome when you're working by yourself in muddy, wet and cold, damp conditions. Oh, well, that's almost one side complete now. The sun is now up, so I can feel my hands again, which is very nice. I like to push myself by laying out as many plants as possible, keep myself going, otherwise I'm tempted to have a break all the time. So yeah, a couple of hours in, doing well. Going to have a nice little drink now and a mince pie and enjoy a bit of sun. So it's the end of day one now, and I've got all of one boundary done, and I'm 17 plants off finishing the second boundary, the bit behind me actually. So what I'm going to do is dip the remaining 17 plants I need, ready for tomorrow, which will be my first job in the morning. And then the rest of our plants that I don't have the holes dug for yet, that are realistically going to be 3 or 4 days away, instead of just leaving them in the bags with the, although they probably would be okay with the roots damp and wrapped up in a plastic bag, I'm actually going to heel these in in some compost just to keep them going, and then they'll last then if I need to wait 2 or 3 weeks. The rain was really bad yesterday, so I didn't get much filming done, but nevertheless I managed to finish one side of the hedging, and I also managed to come along this row here on the flatter, drier ground with the earth auger, which made life a hell of a lot easier. I've now been through and squared up the holes with my shovel, and I'm getting these in, which is much nicer not being in the wet, damp soil. Unless the soil is really poor, I avoid putting compost or other amendments in the hole itself, or mixing it in with the soil and putting in the hole. I prefer to actually apply this on top after I've planted. In this case I'm going to be using compost, and that's just replicating the way it'd be done in nature, with the annual leaf fall coming down each year. Along here was the very wet and boggy boundary, and you can probably see now how I've created this mound by digging a drainage trench behind the laurels themselves. The reason for that is historically one of the neighbours dug a drainage ditch coming down to this corner of the land, which has caused this area to be very boggy. Well, it's another day and the sun is shining. These plants in front of me were some of the plants that were grown in that really boggy anaerobic soil that I showed you, where I've had to now dig those trenches for drainage, and they weren't doing well at all. And you can see here that the foliage on these, instead of a lovely dark strong green, they're very almost yellowy lime coloured, which is a sign in this case that they're just not happy, and that's due to that constantly wet conditions. And I find when the plants go like this, the stems often form quite a maroon colour instead of the dark brown. And when they go like that, they tend not to really establish again. So I want to give these another chance if possible, and I'm going to do that by cutting these back hard now, which I've begun doing to these plants here. And these upper stems, I don't have much hope that they're ever going to be, really strong, vigorous growth again. So I'm relying on new shoots to form at the bottom of the plants, which I'll promote by cutting these back hard. And then before planting, I'm going to remove all the weeds and other growth that are growing around the bottom of these, and knock off the worst of that anaerobic wet soil before inoculating them with our root grow and putting them in a drier position. Alright guys, all of the hedges are now in, and you might just be able to see down this side here. I've been going along and putting a few handfuls of compost around them. Last job to finish off the actual planting is going to be going around and just putting a bunch of wood chips around the base of each one as well, just to suppress the weeds a little bit in their first year of growth until they bush out. And to give an idea how fast a laurel hedge will establish in a full sun position, these are the plants we've just planted, bare root, And these on the left of me were planted last year over winter, and this is what they've done in 1 year. The final stage of what I need to be doing with these now to give them the best chance to establish into a bushy hedge is going to be performing what's called formative pruning. And you'll notice beside me here to the left and right, as I mentioned earlier, we've got one plant here which is bushed out already. It's got shoots coming down from the base here, multiple actually, whereas this one here is just growing on a single stem. And left to its own devices, many hedging plants are actually small trees, can even be large trees, and these will actually stay as a single stem tree if we left it. So I need to intervene in this case to help it to bush out in the first few years, and this is really important, especially for the first 3 years I often find. And what I'm basically going to be doing here is just like how you'd pinch out the tops of common flowering plants to promote more flowers. I'm just going to take the top off here, maybe about the top third, simply like that. And what that will do is now promote new buds to form and shoots come lower down the plant to give us the best chance of a bushy hedge. This hedge behind me here is now about 6 years old, and I've actually been maintaining this one now with a hedge cutter to keep it at this height for about the last 3 years. So you can see you can establish a nice dense evergreen hedge relatively quickly. And along this boundary in a slightly shady area, you can see the distinct difference where an area of the hedge gets more sun as opposed to shadier as we go down. So it's my personal preference to use evergreen Laurel hedging around the external boundaries of Freedom Forest. Not only is it evergreen and beautiful, but it's also the most commonly planted hedge around this area. And if you're thinking of planting your own hedge, it's always worth checking out what's doing well locally. Because if you go 5 miles in this direction, on the alkaline, chalky soils, they just don't do well, and they've always got a bit of a yellowy tinge and they don't grow well. So it's worth keeping that in mind. Also, for some of you more purists out there, internally we do have other types of hedging, like this dead hedging behind me here. And often when things like gorse that I've cut, instead of just burning it, I pile up and then let the bramble grow over it, and that provides a really good home for all types of wildlife, and you also get some free food from it as well. So there are several other options as well if you're looking for not only an evergreen hedge, but something that will grow in the shade. And so Laurel is the first one that we've planted today. Also, you've got Elaeagnus. It's another non-native one, but it does grow very fast and tolerates the shade very well. You've got Western red cedar, which is a conifer, and that's very nice. And with yew as well. Yew is another native actually. It does grow very slowly though. And probably the last one that comes to mind is holly, another native, and that's nice and prickly if you want to keep people out, and it's quite slow growing like yew though as well. But if you know any other hedges or plants that you would recommend or that you love, please let us know in the comments down below. Well guys, I'd like to say a big thank you for watching this video, and thank you to all of you who have subscribed to the channel. And if you haven't already, please be sure to do so, and like and leave us a comment down below about any of the topics in this video. It really helps us out, and it's a pleasure to hear from you as always. Peace and plants.